Hello and welcome to the 20th episode of Who Said What. Thanks for tuning in every week. I'm Krishna and this is the show where I dive into interesting comments made by notable figures from across the world, whether it's finance or the broader business world, and dig into the stories behind them. Today, I have four very interesting comments from RC Bhargava, Mark Zuckerberg, and a few others. Let me get started. See, imagine you run a car company. For decades, you've been growing steadily, expanding your reach and building a reputation as the country's largest car maker. But over the past few years, something strange has been happening. The segment that once made up nearly 40% of your sales, the small, affordable cars, has started shrinking. Not just slowing down, but actually declining. What do? If you're RC Bhargava, the chairman of Maruti Suzuki, you call it like it is. In his latest remarks, he pointed to a hard economic truth that few in the industry openly admit. Most Indians simply can't afford to buy a car anymore. Now, that's a very bold thing to say, especially from someone like him. Here's how he broke it down.
If you look at the household income distribution data, you will find that 200 million households out of 300 million households are having income below $6,000 per year.
That's two-thirds of all Indian households earning less than around 5 lakh annually. And it gets even more stark.
The households which have incomes above $25,000 and between $18,000 and $25,000, they are about 8%. If we go up to 12 lakh of rupees, which is about $14,000, we get another 5-6% added. So about 12% households in India are above 12 lakhs income annually.
In other words, just 12% of Indian households earn enough to think about buying a car that costs 10 lakh rupees or even more. And that price tag, Bhargava says, is what it takes to own a typical car in India, thanks to rising input costs, stricter safety and emission regulations and taxes.
To buy a car costing 10 lakh plus, you normally would need to be in this household bracket of 12 lakhs plus. And therefore, car buying in India is largely restricted to this 12% of households.
And all of this leads to the real punchline.
How can you get high growth if 88% of the country are below levels of income where they cannot afford these cars costing 10 lakhs and above?
This is the crisis at the heart of India's auto industry. It's not that demand has disappeared because people don't want cars. It's that the majority of Indian households have been priced out of the market. And yet, it wasn't always like this. For years, small affordable cars like the Auto or Wagoner were the engines of growth. But as regulations tightened with mandatory airbags, ABS, stricter crash tests and cleaner emission standards, the cost of compliance has quietly pushed up the price of entry-level cars by 80,000 to 90,000 rupee per vehicle. And Mr. Bhargava didn't mince words.
The smaller cars, the cheaper cars, have become unaffordable to these people, as I've said in the past, because of the high cost of implementing regulatory measures.
It's not just incomes that are holding back demand. India remains one of the most under-penetrated car markets in the world. Right now, India has about 34 cars per 1,000 people. For comparison, Indonesia has 90. China has nearly 250. The US over 800. Even with such low penetration, Bhargava warns that the growth has been stalled because the addressable market is simply too small under current pricing. He worries that policymakers and industry watchers have misunderstood what's happening. Some say that Indians are shifting from small cars to bigger, pricier SUVs because they aspire for better status and features. RC Bhargava flatly rejects that.
It's a fallacy to think that the decline in the small car market and the growth of the SUV market is a result of people aspirations changing and people wanting to buy big cars and not wanting small cars. It's not true. What is happening is that people can't afford small cars.
And if small cars are unaffordable, upgrading from a two-wheeler to a car becomes a distant dream. Today, India sells nearly 20 million two-wheelers every year because for the vast majority of Indians, a motorcycle is the only affordable personal vehicle.
This huge chunk, 60-70% of India's population, don't have today an alternative where they can go to another car, go to a safer, more comfortable vehicle for themselves and their families. They are stuck with the two-wheeler for a long, long time.
So, what's the solution? Mr. Bhargava looks to Japan for inspiration. He points to the key cars, tiny, ultra affordable cars with lower taxes, fewer regulations, and targeted incentives that helped millions of Japanese households upgrade from scooters to cars.
I was given the example of the Japanese K car.
Okay.
Those K cars have a different set of regulations compared to the other cars. And the taxes on them are much lower also. That is why those cars, they're smaller cars, but they are cheaper and they're more affordable. And that's how Japan switched from motorcycles to four-wheelers.
India, he says, needs a similar rethink. Right now, cars are taxed at 28% GST plus cess, making even the cheapest cars out of reach for most buyers. Lowering taxes and relaxing some regulations for truly affordable entry cars could be the only way to unlock mass demand again. Because if nothing changes, the future of the Indian car market may not be millions of first-time buyers moving up from two-wheelers, but rather a stagnant, slow-growing market catering only to the country's wealthiest 12%.
Unless, unless somebody can bring the cost of the EV down by half or less. Affordability, that class of people I'm talking about is talking about affordability. If you can give them an electric car at 5 lakhs, yes. Today, nobody can develop at that cost, not even the Chinese.
For Mr. Bhargava, the message is clear. Without a car that the average Indian can afford, growth will stay stuck. Now, on to the second comment. If you have not been paying attention, Meta seems like the biggest AI straggler. Its models garner nowhere near the hype that new labs like OpenAI and Anthropic regularly see. Even the big tech competitors like Grok or Gemini have much more mindshare. DeepSeek's excellent open-weight models have blunted Meta's open sourcing edge as well. But the AI race isn't anywhere near being over, and Meta is pulling out the big guns, bringing everything it has learned over the years for this new project. Or at least that's the signal we are seeing in a recent interview that Mark Zuckerberg gave to Dwarkesh Patel. For one, Meta's next bet is to create an AI that knows you intimately. It's doing so using a personalization loop, as Zug told Dwarkesh.
And, I think that this is going to be a really big year on all of this because especially once you start getting the personalization loop going, which we're just starting to build in now, really, from both the context that all the algorithms have about what you're interested in feed and all your profile information, all the social graph information, but also just what you're interacting with the AI about. I think that's just going to be kind of the next thing that's going to be super exciting. So really big on that.
And look, if you're a regular user of AI, you have probably already been creeped out a couple of times by what all it knows about you. And if that hasn't yet happened to you, just open your most used AI app and ask it to give an honest, unfiltered opinion of you without sugarcoating things. And you'll realize it knows things. Zuckerberg wants to dial this up to 11. Meta already has years worth of data on you from all your Facebook and Instagram activity. He's going to teach all that to AI as well. You know how Reels have that scary ability of giving you junk that's tailored exactly to the person you are, keeping you watching for hours at an end? Well, the AI you talk to might soon have that uncanny understanding of you as well. But that's not all. There's another ingredient to this. He wants to change how people interact with AI apps from the current chatbot-centric way of doing things to something much more conversational. From his conversation with Dwarkesh once again.
And I think being able to mix kind of that in with the right personalization is going to lead towards a product experience where, I would basically just guess that you go forward a few years, like we're just going to be talking to AI throughout the day about different things that we're wondering. And, it's like you'll have your phone, you'll talk to it on your phone, you'll talk to it while you're browsing your feed apps. It'll give you context about different stuff. You'll be able to answer questions. It'll help you as you're interacting with people in messaging apps. Eventually I think we'll walk through our daily lives and we'll either have glasses or other kinds of AI devices and just be able to kind of seamlessly interact with it all day long. So I think that's kind of the North Star, and whatever the benchmarks are that lead towards people feeling like the the quality is like that's what they want to interact with, that I think is actually the thing that is ultimately going to matter the most to us.
Now, we have already seen other labs focus on having AI models talk. Now, that's not an innovation by itself. What caught our attention, though, was the overall vision of you constantly in touch with your voice based AI companion all day long, a little like Iron Man and Jarvis. For that to happen, it's not enough that your AI app is intelligent or capable, it needs to also be sticky. That's what stands out to us. Meta's focus with AI is no longer just making it more intelligent. Zuckerberg wants to break away from the current AI benchmarks where they test if models can solve a test of increasingly difficult problems. If you have ever wondered why people keep talking about things like how well models can solve PhD level maths question, it's because of these benchmarks.
You also mentioned the whole chatbot arena thing, which I think is interesting, and it goes to this challenge around how do you do the benchmarking, right? And basically, how do you know what models are good for which things? And one of the things that we've generally tried to do over the last year is anchor more of our models in our Meta AI product North Star use cases, because the issue with both kind of open source benchmarks and any given thing like the LM Arena stuff is they're often skewed for either a very specific set of use cases, which are often not actually what any normal person does in your product. They are often weighted, kind of the portfolio of things that they're trying to measure is different from what people care about in any given product. And because of that, we've found that trying to optimize too much for that stuff has often led us astray.
Instead, Meta wants to crack some way of pushing people to constantly go back to their AI app, and it has a track record of doing so. You know how you seem to open Instagram without thinking whenever you are idle because it's just so addictive? Well, that's the kind of thing Zuckerberg wants to bring to AI. That's right. Meta's old metaverse dreams aren't over. They've evolved into a pair of AR enabled glasses that will eliminate the need for specific computer devices. And because of that, they might be something that you're constantly in touch with, as though they're simply another layer to your physical world. Bring this all together and you see Zuckerberg's grand vision. A new device that's always on your eyes, an AI who you're constantly talking to, which knows you inside out and is fitted with algorithms that marry your AI with the addictiveness of Instagram. I'm not sure if the future makes me excited or uncomfortable. To bring this whole vision to fruition, Meta plans to move to AI agents that will code the next generation of AI. And no, I don't mean AI models helping human developers code the way so many do today. I mean agents that basically act as complete virtual software engineers.
We're trying to build a coding agent and an AI research agent that that basically advances llama research specifically, and it's like just fully kind of plugged into our tool chain and all this. So I think that that's important, and I think is going to end up being an important part of how this stuff gets done. I would guess that like sometime in the next 12 to 18 months, we'll reach the point where like most of the code that's going towards these efforts is written by AI. And I don't mean like autocomplete. I mean, right today you have kind of, good autocomplete, like you start writing something and it can complete the kind of section of code. I'm talking more like you give it a goal, it can run tests, right? It can kind of improve things. It can find issues. It writes higher quality code than like the average very good person on the team already.
On one hand, this probably means we are soon approaching a point where AI development will suddenly take off at a level we can't imagine, with physical infrastructure being the only limiting factor for how fast we can go. On the other hand, every dystopian AI sci-fi story begins with AI learning to train AI. So there's that. Now on to the third comment. See, a big part of our job, by that I mean people running this channel, is to stay in touch with the news all the time. But I'll be honest, this whole saga around tariffs is something I've been actively trying to avoid. One day they decide something, the next day everything changes, and this has happened so many times now that I just tapped out of it. But here's the thing. Even if me or anyone else has tuned out of the daily back and forth, the impact of all of this is very real. The constant flip flopping has created this whole mood of uncertainty hanging over the global economy. Even the IMF, in their latest World Economic Outlook report, basically admitted it. I'd written about this earlier on the Daily Brief. In fact, things are so uncertain right now that the IMF had to switch how they make predictions. Normally, they use something called a baseline forecast. Basically, their best estimate of how the world will look next year. But this time, they couldn't even do that. Instead, they use something called as reference scenario, which is really just freezing their model and saying, okay, let's assume the world looks like this. These tariffs, these interest rates, and this level of chaos, and we'll base out numbers on that. It's like admitting we don't know what's going to happen, so let's just freeze the madness here and work with it. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Recently, IMF released a video where Gita Gopinath, the IMF's deputy managing director, and Raghuram Rajan, the former RBI governor, were talking about how emerging countries like India have actually handled these tough times pretty well. Here's what Gita Gopinath said.
I mean, kudos to emerging markets. They've actually demonstrated a lot of resilience after some pretty tough knocks, including the pandemic, including the energy crisis that we saw.
But then she explains why they were able to stay strong. She says,
the reason that they had that resilience was they built up good, solid monetary policy frameworks. The inflation targeting regime, maintaining that credibility and the commitment to it in an uncertain environment.
now she's saying that countries like India built strong systems for keeping inflation under control. They had clear targets for inflation. They didn't panic and change their approach every time something went wrong globally. They stayed the course, and because of that, they earned something super valuable in central banking: credibility. But here's where things get tricky. She points out that staying credible in today's world is way harder than it used to be. The answer is again unpredictability. And when everything's changing all the time, it becomes really hard for central banks to communicate clearly. And the tough part, she says, is if you explain too much, people might get confused or think you're flip flopping. But if you explain too little, people might think you're hiding something or that you don't have a grip on things. And that's when she turns to Raghuram Rajan and basically asks him,
how do you communicate as a central banker in an emerging market? Because on one hand, you're still in the process, several are still in the process of building credibility, and talking too much can create a lot of confusion and not really help. But on the other hand, when you're in this environment when there's so much uncertainty, how do you convey that you are sticking to your mandate and you are sticking to the goals of monetary policy?
he says,
just on the independence, I think no set of laws can protect a central bank when society turns against it.
yeah, I didn't understand this either. I took help of GPT. He's saying that it doesn't matter if the law says the central bank is independent. If the people, politicians, or society stop trusting the central bank, no piece of paper is going to save it. Independence isn't something you automatically get because it's written in law. It's something you earn by convincing people that you're doing something important, that you're holding things together. And he explains it even more.
Your independence comes from the constituencies who believe you perform a vital function. And it need not be the head of state, but it can be bond market players, it can be banks, it can be the broader public, which likes a regime of low inflation, and you've convinced them that you're central to that aspect.
Basically, a central bank's independence depends on the people who believe in it. It could be investors who care about low inflation. It could be regular people like you and me who just don't want prices to spiral out of control. If those people believe that central bank is protecting them, they'll stand up for its independence. Then he talks about communication.
Part of your communication is to indicate that this is an important function. And you're trying to go beyond the set of analysts who follow you very carefully to the broader public and say, look, we are providing a function which is important. There is a reason we just don't reduce interest rates, because it can affect you in so many ways through the currency, through longer term inflation, etc.
Here, he's saying a central bank can't just communicate to economists. It needs to talk to regular people. It needs to explain, look, we are not randomly changing interest rates. We are doing this to keep inflation under control. So your savings don't lose value. So food prices don't go crazy. So the economy stays steady. You have to help people understand why your work matters to them personally. But then he gives this really honest warning.
That communication has to be handled very carefully because if you communicate too much, it's not just you confuse. Politicians get angry. Why are you interacting with their constituency? You're unelected. How come you can do this? If you communicate too little, you haven't built up the support which you absolutely need against the forces who want to go in the other direction.
Then Raghuram Rajan talks about something really relatable for anyone in India, the dollar rupee rate. He says that in India, everyone from politicians to middle class families watches the dollar rupee exchange rate, not anything else. Parents sending their kids to study in the US, businesses importing or exporting goods, they all care about how many rupees it takes to buy $1.
In India, for example, everybody watches the dollar rupee rate. Not the real effective exchange rate or the nominal, it's the dollar rupee rate. A lot of middle class parents have their kids in the US. That affects the funding of those things. It becomes a very central number. And so if that starts collapsing, questions are raised in Parliament. Why is the rupee depreciating so much against the dollar? And it becomes a source potentially of some kinds of panic.
If the rupee fails fast, people start to panic. Parliament asks question. It becomes political. So what does the Reserve Bank of India do? Raghuram Rajan explains that they don't try to fix an exchange rate at a specific number. They don't say 80 rupee per dollar and that's it. That would be risky. Instead, they focus on smoothing out the big swings. If the rupee is falling too fast, they slow it down. If it's rising too fast, they slow that too. The goal isn't to defend a number, it's to prevent chaos. Finally, he warns about something central banks in richer countries like the US have done, buying government bonds or other assets to stabilize markets. He says, sure, it can work for a while, but one day the central bank will have to sell those assets. And when that happens, it could cause prices to crash, and that creates new problems. In the end, both Gita Gopinath and Raghuram Rajan are basically saying in today's world where everything's unpredictable, policies keep changing, markets are jittery. Central banks in emerging markets have to be really careful. They need to stay independent, communicate clearly, manage inflation, keep markets calm, and use their tools wisely. Now, on to the last comment. India's Finance Secretary Ajay Seth, in a recent interview at the Hudson Institute, spoke about how India's goal of becoming a developed country by 2047. He made some striking claims about manufacturing and development, claims that challenge a lot of what we have been taught about how nations grow rich. These comments jumped out at me because they go directly against the playbook that transformed Japan, South Korea, and more recently China from poor to prosperous. And they tie into an even bigger argument from economist Richard Baldwin, who believes the old path to development is closing for newcomers. Ajay Seth was clear. Manufacturing is still critical for India's future. With 55% of Indians living in rural areas and 40% relying on agriculture, which only makes 17% of GDP, he called moving people into non-farm work an absolute imperative.
55% of Indian population is in rural area. Agriculture, and say about those dependent on agriculture, is about 40%. And agriculture today constitutes about 17% of GDP, growing at 3%. Manufacturing grows at 6%, services grows at 9%. In India, this orderly transition from agriculture to non-agriculture is an absolute imperative.
But here's where things get really interesting. He explicitly rejected the traditional export-led model. He said,
first, this economic model of growing by exporting with or without significant domestic consumption, that economic model is no longer valid in 21st century.
Instead, he pitched a more balanced approach.
Make for India, make for the world.
Why? His argument is that a country of 1.4 billion people can't depend on imports alone, and beyond that, relying too heavily on exports while keeping domestic consumption low just creates global trade imbalances. And as he put it,
Any economy which is trying to export its way while keeping its domestic consumption will create imbalance for the global economy. It will not work.
to really understand why his comments matter, you have to look back at how other countries got rich. Japan was the first to show what manufacturing led growth could do after World War II. They started with textiles, moved into steel and shipbuilding in the 1960s, then into cars and electronics in the 1970s, and later into semiconductors and robotics in the 1980s. The steady climb up the value chain delivered 10% growth a year for decades. South Korea copied that model almost step for step. Starting in 1962, they launched 5-year plans, picked big family run conglomerates, gave them cheap credit and protection, but insisted they export. The payoff was huge. Per capita income jumped from $103 in 1962 to almost $5,500 by 1989. China got a later start, but they scaled even faster. They kicked off special economic zones in places like Shenzhen in 1979, offering tax breaks and infrastructure to lower-in export-focused manufacturers. The results were staggering. Nearly 10% growth a year for 40 years, 800 million people pulled out of poverty, and China becoming the world's factory and now making nearly 30% of all global manufacturing output. Each of these countries followed the same formula: use cheap labor to build export industries, then slowly move up the ladder into higher value products. But Richard Baldwin, an economist who's been studying this for years, thinks that the ladder is getting harder to climb. His research shows that from 2008 to 2020, 60% of lower middle income countries and a whopping 85% of other developing economies didn't follow this manufacturing export path. In fact, many were moving in the opposite direction.
Right now, 60% of the low middle income countries are doing it, and 85% of the upper middle income countries are doing it. So de facto, people have switched from manufacturing export-led growth to service export-led growth. Deal with it. That's what's happening.
Why? Baldwin points to 3 big shifts. First, automation. As he explains, Digitech automates labor out of manufacturing and international cost differences shrink. Now, what's the translation for this? See, robots don't care if labor is cheap. Automation makes wages less of a deciding factor. Second, China's dominance. Baldwin says that China has become the world's sole manufacturing superpower with an output bigger than the next 9 countries combined. China overtook the US in manufacturing share back in the late 2000s and has since doubled it. There's just not much room left for new players.
China's output is now larger than the next 9 countries put together. It is the world's sole manufacturing superpower. This is something that's not quite as well recognized as it probably should be, because when people talk about decoupling or localizing supply chains, I don't think they really understand that 35% of world production and manufacturing is in China.
Third, the rise of digital services. Baldwin predicts that intermediate services trade will grow much faster than goods trade for the foreseeable future. In other words, services, not factory goods, are going to drive global trade growth.
So manufacturing export-led growth is dying. Service export-led growth is happening.
See, Richard Baldwin thinks that the future is about service export-led growth. Instead of copying China's Shenzhen, he imagines developing countries building the next Bangalore. Development hubs powered by skilled workers and digital tools, not assembly lines. And interestingly, Ajay Seth's vision for India seems to echo this shift. While he still sees a role for manufacturing, he's betting big on services too. A prime example, India's 3-layer digital public infrastructure. The first layer is Aadhaar, India's national ID system, which processes 90 million authentications every day. The second is UPI, India's instant payment system, which handles 550 million transactions worth $9 billion every day. And the third layer is a consent system to protect digital privacy. The digital backbone has transformed India's economy without relying on traditional manufacturing. As Ajay Seth pointed out,
Second piece of the second layer is a payment layer. which is a UPI. That payment layer, and just stepping back, today 90 million authentications happen every day on Aadhaar. On UPI, number of transactions every day are 550 million. That means 1 in every 2 adult Indian does an Aadhaar in a day.
There is another fascinating piece to Ajay Seth's argument. He insists democracy is essential for development.
See, coming from a country with 1.4 billion people, my entire life being a beneficiary of a democracy, I don't see any other viable means of a governance model.
This flips another piece of conventional wisdom. The old manufacturing model often worked best under authoritarian regimes that could suppress consumption to boost exports. Democracies, by contrast, had to balance citizen demands with economic goals. But a services-led model needs things like reliable electricity, internet access, and educated workers. Investments that often happen faster in responsive democracies where voters can pressure leaders for better services. As Ajay Seth put it,
no amount of diktat or saying do this, do that will not work. It is an incentive which works with the people.
he believes that India can keep growing at 7% a year over the next decade. If the global environment is favorable, maybe even 7.5%. If not, maybe 6.5 to 7%. But hitting those numbers means India has to deepen its domestic growth drivers and boost productivity. If Baldwin is right that manufacturing export-led growth is dead or dying, then developing countries face a sobering truth. The escalator that lifted billions out of poverty is slowing down, just as more people are trying to get on. This debate between Ajay Seth and Baldwin isn't just academic. It's about whether the global economy still offers a clear, reliable path from poverty to prosperity for the billions who haven't made that journey yet. That's it for this episode. If you have any feedback for me, please let me know in the comments below. अरे भाई क्या हो गया?
विक्स की गोली लो, खिच-खिच दूर करो.
To a hard economic truth, and it has a track record of doing so. Well, that's Zuckerberg.
देखो इन्हें ये है.
And is fitted with fittest. क्या भाई क्या बोल रहे हो? Of Indians living in rural areas.
ये मुंह से सुपारी निकाल के बात कर रहे बाबा.
मैं चली देखो